Hi, everyone. I'm going to do the lectures this week on video, and this is going to be the first of several. What I want to do at the beginning is really set up this whole discussion about relativism by dealing with some of the broader philosophical issues at stake. When we talk about cultural relativism and human rights, the issue is really a tension between the aspiration for some kind of universal approach to human rights, a universal set of obligations and a universal set of rights for every human being, and on the other hand, the diversity of cultures and wanting to be tolerant and respectful of cultural difference and religious difference and ethical differences across the world. So how do we resolve that tension? This is really one of the questions that comes up. Cultural relativism is one proposal for dealing with that. But before I get into cultural relativism, I want to sort of make a few broad remarks about how we think about cultural diversity and respect and toleration of different cultures. The first thing I want to say is that the society that most of us live in, or I should say, I think the society that we all live in, the people in this class and most of the people I interact with at Gratz College, we all have a fairly healthy respect and openness for other cultures. But I want to point out that that's something that we've been educated to think. That's not necessarily something that happens spontaneously. I mean, it may happen spontaneously where someone grows up in a society and they just sort of have a sense of openness. But in our society, we've actually received a very specific education about cultural tolerance and openness. Now, I say our society, I don't necessarily mean all of the United States of America, or in the United States of America, maybe to different degrees, depending on where you received your education or what kind of family you come from. So it's not, when I say our society, I kind of mean us in this class and not necessarily everyone in America. But I would say that the kind of education we've received means that we're very aware of the fact that there are cultural biases, that there's a tendency that for people in one culture to look at another culture and perhaps denigrate it, that it's common for people to look at another culture and find it unusual or strange or different, and for that to be the basis for denigrating that culture, and that's something that we should work to overcome. Again, these are the things that we think in our part of the world, right? And we may have a very imperfect education. We may not always be good at overcoming those biases, but we kind of know that those biases are a problem, that they exist, and they're worth overcoming in order to be more respectful and tolerant of other cultures. But the thing that I want to emphasize is the fact that we think that way is a product of our own culture, is a product of the society we live in, is a product of the education we've received, and a set of linguistic and conceptual tools that we've been given as part of our education that shapes the way we think about cultural differences. And we have to be aware of the fact that not every society educates people that way. And that the ones that do don't always do it the right way. So, for example, I mean, if you think about anti-racism training in this country, right, there was a point at which people talk very openly about the importance of being colorblind, about not noticing race. And I think we now understand that that's not really a helpful way to think about overcoming racism, right? So it's a form of, it was a genuine and well-meaning attempt to do anti-racism training that probably didn't live up to its promise. So again, we may not have the best form of the kind of cultural openness that we should have, but at least we are kind of striving for it. And again, the point I want to emphasize is that that's something that's a product of our education, a product of our culture, a product of the society or the sub-society that we live in. So if you think about Rorty's point about how human rights is not really based on the idea of some sort of common human nature, and yet he talks about how important it is to maintain the kind of liberal democratic society that you have in North America and Western Europe. his argument isn't, again, that it's not that North America and Western Europe are inherently superior societies. His point is that the reason that human rights and toleration and respect for other cultures have become a very important part of our societies, and the education that we receive, is because of cultural practices in our societies, not because we have some sort of access to the real universal ahistorical truth about human nature. Right. So if you want to ask me more about that separately, right, that's really Rorty's point, is that having cultural tolerance and respect for other cultures is a result of education, social practices, and language development, meaning one's the linguistic tools that we have, and not because somehow people in Western Europe have access to human nature more than other people do. Okay, so that's the first point. The second point is that when we discuss respect and tolerance, it's important to keep in mind that in general, we often seek to respect and show tolerance for people with whom we disagree. So if people disagree about an important moral issue, we may want to show respect for their point of view, and we would say that we would tolerate their point of view in various ways, however we would describe that. I would also say that it's important to keep in mind that there may be areas where we have moral disagreements with people, but we don't seek to impose our view on them through the law. Now, there are cases where we think that something of moral importance should be a part of the law, but that's not always the case. And the reason I make that point is because I want us to note that sometimes moral disagreements don't have to be a part of law. They can be things that we can say, well, we can live with these moral disagreements. It doesn't. My point of view doesn't have to be the law of the land on a particular moral point. It doesn't mean that I think my moral position doesn't really matter, or that I think that, it doesn't matter between me and the other person, my moral point of view. It just means that I think on this particular case, it's not worth it making my moral point of view the law of the land, or have it be coerced for everybody as a result of my point of view, right? Even if a majority hold that point of view. And that brings me to a third point, which is the value of humility. Humility is both a moral virtue. You can call it the moral virtue of thinking that not everything's about you. It's also an intellectual virtue. It means that as an intellectual virtue, it means respecting the intelligence and the rationality of people with whom you have disagreements and differences of opinion. And also recognizing the possibility that even if you have a fairly high level of confidence in your moral point of view or your intellectual point of view, you might be wrong. It might turn out that you're wrong. And so maybe you're open to continuing to have a discussion, open to reasonable forms of disagreement where you can learn from other people with whom you disagree. So a scientist might think that another scientist is wrong about their scientific theory, but still respect their work as a scientist. That's one form of humility. You can also have humility towards some of the great minds of the past. Certainly, scientists of today would look back at Isaac Newton and see that there were all sorts of things where he was wrong, or he just missed certain nuances of physics that have been developed since then, but they would all recognize what a great mind he was and what a great scientist he was for his time, and that's another form of humility. In the area of moral ideals, humility towards the past gets a little bit more complicated. So if you take the example of Aristotle, a great philosopher, we can say that Aristotle is a great moral philosopher. We may learn a great deal about important moral values and virtues from Aristotle, but at the same time recognize that his views are misogynistic and racist. And that's a tough one to sort of deal with. But I think one thing that you can say is that that the misogyny and the racism was so deeply embedded in his time that even a great moral thinker like Aristotle would have had a hard time overcoming those views, and that it would take other processes and other developments in human history for people to distance themselves from that kind of misogyny and racism that was quite common at that time. And so it's possible to recognize Aristotle as a great moral thinker while acknowledging his misogyny and racism. And that's a kind of humility as well. And then we can have humility towards people in the present. And humility towards people in the present means, again, recognizing that you may have a difference of opinion with them, but still respecting them and respecting their point of view. But the key thing in here, I would say, is that you don't have to have the same level of respect for everybody. So you may say that some disagreements are reasonable and some other disagreements are less reasonable, and that some disagreements seem plausible to you, or there's a place where you're willing to say, well, this is what I think, but maybe I'm wrong. But there are other places where you say, I am not wrong about this. I have a high level of confidence in my moral belief. And I think that people who are holding that moral belief, the opposite moral belief, are just dead wrong, and their opinions sort of matter less as a result, right? If I take the example of slavery, I think it's quite clear that slavery is morally wrong. And if someone told me that they thought that slavery was morally permissible, I would automatically discount that. But there might be other moral issues where I wouldn't automatically discount it, where I'd be open to engaging the person in conversation more. And that I would say is humility at an intrinsic level. I mean, I might, if someone told me that slavery was morally permissible, I might have strategic reasons to have a conversation with them, or to treat them, I might not be rude to them just to make a point, but I wouldn't really be taking their moral opinion seriously. I wouldn't really be open to listening to what they had to say on that moral question, or probably on others as well. So humility doesn't mean that we have to be equally respectful of everybody. We can kind of make those distinctions about where it's more appropriate to be humble towards someone with whom we disagree, and where it's less appropriate. So now I want to connect that just a little bit to the question of human rights and the question of cultural relativism. So one possible objection to international human rights standards is that each culture has different standards of right and wrong. And certainly that's true. But then the question is, does that mean that the whole idea of human rights is inherently disrespectful to the diversity of cultures? So I think the first thing I want to say then is that it's possible to recognize that there have been times where the formulation or the implementation of human rights laws have been culturally imperialistic or insensitive. It's possible that there have been incidents like that. But that doesn't mean that the idea of human rights as a kind of universal set of moral values is inherently problematic from the standpoint of cultural diversity, right? So it's possible to make that distinction. It's possible to see that sometimes it was done wrong, right? So, but at the same time, it's still possible to maybe find human rights that are genuinely culturally sensitive. And it's also worth mentioning that we might accept the idea that there are human rights standards for everyone, but disagree about what those standards are, and that those disagreements might be rooted in cultural or religious differences, right? So the fact that there might be disagreements and different ideas about what human rights should look like doesn't mean that human rights isn't a thing. That doesn't mean that we couldn't at least philosophically hold out the possibility for some notion of a universal standard for human rights. Again, we may get it wrong sometimes as we strive to achieve that, but that doesn't mean that the project is inherently problematic from a philosophical point of view or from a moral point of view. And so what that means essentially is that cultural difference does not necessitate holding a view of cultural relativism. That's where I'll stop right here, and then I'll talk about cultural relativism in the next segment.